Hello, everybody. So so far we've heard about what we do and the importance of seeing it through, getting it published, and getting out into the open. But I wanted to talk about, well, take a little bit more of a scientific approach and talk about how we use this time of year to try and get the most out of archaeology as possible. So that's going to be in a few different ways. I'm going to look at survey, as that's something I tend to do, and it's something we end up doing a lot this time of year. Um, so non-invasive investigations. This time of year is very much our season for doing geophysics and other types of non-invasive survey. And this is a type of investigation that not only helps us to identify sites, but it can also help us to learn an awful lot about the archaeological site itself. And that's through, there's many different means of doing this. Some of it involves getting out into the field, and often, as you can see from our picture of Beaking Rin, sometimes getting rather cold out in the field. But very much it's this time of year tends to be the best for it. It's between the crop rotation, so all the crop is gone, so we can get into the fields and do surveys. But also there's less leaves on the trees, so our GPS equipment tends to work a little bit better. So lots of different advantages and lots of different methods that we tend to use. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what we have been using for remote sensing and non-invasive surveys. And then we're going to move into talking about more of the analysis we've been doing of the post-excavation work and excavation work we've been doing over the summer. So I was going to lead with this, a fantastic example of geophysics for our region. This is the Rosset Roman Villa, and it's the first confirmed Roman villa in northeast Wales. So it was a project headed by the University of Chester, for which we provided the geophysical survey. And as you can see here beautifully, we've got the outline of a corridor villa. I can't stress enough that seeing something like this in geophysical data is quite unusual. We don't often see something that is a beautiful, effectively blueprint or floor print of a villa to the extent that you almost needn't bother excavating it. But there's an awful lot we can learn from this information after having also excavated that or seeing at university, having seen that through in the summer after. And I would pick this in particular because it's a good example of what sometimes how geophysics can be a little bit misleading in what we expect as archaeologists. You can see this beautiful outline of a villa, a corridor villa here. Let me just get some annotations up. So you can see it here, lovely and clear, and made up of these very sharp linear elements, and they are the walls. Straight away, we were able to very happily interpret that as the layout of our villa. You've got a main corridor, two flanking buildings on either side, and then a series of rooms behind it. Now, interestingly, with geophysics, why I say this is unusual is when it comes to structures, we're used to seeing a scatter of noise, or a collection of noise, I should say. And that's often because we're looking at the demolition of a building. So something like a villa, one of the last things to come down is the roof and ceramic. So that tends to be very noisy in a magnetic survey, which is what this is. But on this occasion, we can see that the building is lovely and clear. In contrast, we've got something else over here. And it's also, you can see it on this side. Collection of noise and increased magnetic activity, but nowhere near as great a definition as what you can see on the villa. Now, through excavating this side, the reason for this is that the walls are gone. They were robbed out. And what's been left behind is the robber trenches, where the walls had once been, and then they've been infilled with all the material that wasn't wanted. And over the years, the plough has removed all of the rubble from on top, which would normally create that scatter. But down here, we've got, when we excavated it, that proved to be the much better preserved remains of a Roman bathhouse. And the reason we can't see the walls is because in amongst those walls is surviving Roman floors, including opus signinum concrete flooring, which makes them a lot different to see, because the whole nature of geophysics is we're looking for changes in what is the natural background, and then you need contrast. And because in that structure, which is much higher preservation, we haven't got that contrast compared to the building that's been robbed out, that sometimes can be a lot more difficult to see. So use that as a great example of the sort of thing we're thinking about this time of year. And I partly say this because these are the sort of realizations and sort of revisiting that we ended up doing after the excavations, which were in September. Another example of something a little bit more recent is the excavations we've been doing in Croxton's Field in Holt. As you can see from the photo at the top, this was done very much well, it was done in January, between December and January last year. And it was very much flooded. We were surrounded on all, well, three sides by the floodwaters. Although, interestingly, sometimes in geophysics that can be a positive thing. It's rather horrible to work in as a geophysicist, but it can sometimes help to enhance the data. On this occasion, we've got the fantastic remains of a Roman settlement with a roadway running through it here, and then spurs coming off it with lots of different roads, and then series of settlement enclosures. The one thing to note, and like I say, normally geophysics is a means to an end. It's a way for us to identify and locate sites, but there's also more information that we can prize out of this that really helps us to unlock more understanding of the character and nature of the archaeology we're looking at. And part of it is you can see how in this area around the settlement, the readings get a lot stronger, whereas the further away you get towards the south, they get a lot weaker. And that is a product of this being the focal point of the settlement. There's increased human activity, all the wash and debris from all that activity, the burning, the ceramics, the bone, that's being washed into all these linear gullies and making them stand out more from the natural around it. Whereas when you've got the road a little bit further to the south, where there's less activity, it's more associated with field systems and agriculture. There's less occupational debris being washed up into features, and therefore causing less of highlighting the feature less. But other methods sometimes can be quite a bit more favorable this time of year, mainly because it doesn't involve leaving the office. I can sit at my desk with a cup of coffee, is looking at aerial data. So a combination of LiDAR and also spectral analysis of aerial photography. So this is utilizing the sort of data that's collected from aircraft or sometimes drones. So if anyone is familiar with LiDAR, it's not a subsurface type of survey, unlike the geophysics you saw previously. That is looking for remains under the ground. LiDAR is looking for very, very slight changes in the surface. So on this occasion, you can see that the LiDAR and a combination of the two different analysis versions of the LiDAR, as well as the aerial photography, spectral analysis, has highlighted a previously unknown Roman fort near to Basingstoke Abbey. So we're pretty pleased about that, because that ties in with a lot of what we've been doing this year. So now I want to move on to some more of the excavation, post-excavation stuff. Now, what we're trying to do with some of our recent work to try and get as much information out of the excavation work as we possibly can, because what a lot of people don't see is, although when you come and volunteer with us, you see the amount of work we do on site, that is almost doubled when we get off the excavation as well. But also I'm going to use the opportunity to really impress the importance of specialists and how they are so very valuable to all us archaeologists. So what, when, and how, they're all the things we're trying to achieve when we're looking through our site data. Now, a lot of this Sophie has already touched upon. Once we bring all this back into the office, we are collating our data together, we're producing our 3Ds, and our minimal output is to understand that information and then to produce, of course, a report. But to try and get as much as possible out of the information we are able to recover, that's where our specialists come in. And I'm going to use a few case studies now just to really emphasize and the importance and difference a little bit of knowledge, well, not a little bit of knowledge, a great deal of knowledge in a certain subject can bring to one of our archaeological excavations. Now, this site is Townfield Lane, so this is quite a few years ago now, 2022. So it was an excavation of a small card-shaped enclosure near to the Holt Roman Tile and Pottery Works, just on the other side of the border in Farndon. So it's the remains of what we identified as a temporary Roman encampment. What we did not expect to find, however, was the remains of this unusual looking thing. It was absolutely full of industrial waste, referred to as slag. So we identified it on site as probably some form of furnace. So we wanted to get a better understanding of what that furnace was, and so we engaged a specialist, Dr. Jerry McDonnell. Now, he was able to look at our industrial residues and immediately confirm, yes, we are looking at a furnace, specifically a bloomery or bloom furnace. So it's for processing iron. So, and he was able to also identify that they were using bog iron, so locally sourced bog iron, very easily to obtain. It occurs in areas where there are a lot of sort of iron panning through waterlogged deposits. So he was also then able to take all the industrial residues that we had and separate them into different types of industrial residue. So, and they included something called the tap slag. Now, the tap slag is the molten material, so the liquid material that gathers within a furnace. And it's called tap slag because what you effectively do is once you've reached your high temperature, you knock a hole in the side of the furnace and it pours out like a tap. He was also able to identify smelt slag, so this is the stuff that gathers at the bottom of the furnace. Slag lining, so this is slag that still had the clay lining of the furnace attached to it. Tubes, which are stuff that has effectively, well, dribbled out of the front of the furnace, and also slag cake. Now, interestingly, slag cake, all these other ones, they are directly associated with the smelting process and the process of getting your blooms, whereas slag cake is more associated with smithing, so a different type of activity. But notice that all the others are on one side of the enclosure, built into the former embankment, and you've got the smithing work is on the other side. So immediately then that was, you know, it's a division of activity. You've got the smelting on one side and then the processing and making on the other. But the other thing that Jerry was able to do is he was able to look specifically at the tap slag, and he identified that it had not achieved full fluidity. So unlike, as I said before, normally you would break a hole into the side of the furnace and it would pour out. Well, this didn't happen because the furnace didn't reach a high enough temperature. So as a result, it had to be raked out. Now, this makes this a particular type of furnace called a non-tapping furnace. And they date to one of two periods, either the Iron Age, so the beginning of iron processing, or to the early post-Roman and early medieval period, or what historians would call the Dark Ages. And we know from the stratigraphic relationship on our site that this feature was cut into deposits that contained Roman material. Therefore, it had to post-date the Roman period. So through just the analysis of the industrial wastes, Jerry was able to date our furnace to the early post-Roman period. And that was then backed up through our environmental sampling of the charcoal. And fortunately, amongst that charcoal, we also found charred cereal grains from food that was also being processed on site. And that was dated thankfully, to the early post-Roman period, and very early post-Roman period, with date ranges from 570 AD through to 640. So very much placing it in the early formation of what we now recognise as the cultural identities of Britain, so Wales and the emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So a fantastic find for the area, and practically dated and understood almost purely through the industrial waste, which is a material so very often overlooked. And then we've also got Basingstoke Abbey. So this is what I'm going to concentrate mostly on, because this is the work that we've been doing recently this year as Heneb. So this is a site, if anyone's unaware of it, we've been working on now since 2023. And we were brought on board by Flintshire County Council and the Greenfield Valley Heritage Park to get a better understanding of what was going on around the monastic complex of Basingstoke Abbey. And we were expecting to find lots of medieval, and we didn't. Instead, we added 1,000 years of history to the site by discovering a Romano-British settlement underneath it. So to go through that process, this is a great example of how we pull that information together. And this is by far the oldest form of understanding an archaeological site. And it's what we basically refer to as stratigraphy. It's looking at how features relate to each other. And from this section alone, you get several different periods and phases that show a very long span of occupation on the site. You've got a large medieval defensive ditch, the upper fills of which are associated with the Reformation, also the dissolution of the monastery and its demolition, whereas the lower fills are associated potentially with the much earlier occupational activity within the abbey, or possibly one of its medieval precursors. You've then also got this deposit here, which is associated with a Romano-British abandonment. So it was full of late 1st and early 2nd century pottery. That was sealing the fill of a V-shaped gully, and that belongs to a roundhouse platform. And that also contained Roman ceramics, but predominantly of a 1st century date. But they also covered this feature, which was an oven, absolutely full of mussel shell and firecracked stone, but absolutely no ceramic, likely suggesting that this is a feature belonging to the Iron Age. So to help us make sense of those individual deposits, we often rely on the artifacts that are found within them. And this, again, is where the specialist comes in, and where we engage people who really know what they're talking about when it comes to individual types of finds. And this is just a small sample of the finds that we've been recovering from Basingstoke. You've got what the sort of stuff that we expected, which is this here. You've got monastic floor tiles. This is a mosaic floor tile, so slightly earlier. But unfortunately, like many of the medieval stuff we found on this site, that was recovered from deposits associated with the demolition of the abbey. You've also got this early post-medieval key, which interestingly was found very, very close to the front door of the abbey. You've also got this, which was a bit of the odd one out, in a sense. It is Viking, or Hiberno-Norse, more accurately. It's a baldric associated with a sword sheath. But then you've also got our Roman, which by far outnumbered the sort of material we were finding on site. You've got the sort of stuff that is produced locally, which is here. This is pottery made in Holt, near Wrexham. But then you've got stuff from much further afield. So here you've got Gaulish Samian ware with a fantastic hunting scene on it, where you can see a hunting dog, antlers, and a hare up here. But then you've also got some of the very dateable material like this, which is our coin of Trajan, dating to 110 AD. So all these are absolutely vital in helping us to understand sort of distribution of what's happening on site, but also the date ranges. And having had these analysed, we can also see that our Romano-British phase at the moment at Basingstoke Abbey spans the late 1st century through to the end of the 2nd century. So you've got a peak of activity in the 2nd century, whereas there doesn't seem to be very much represented beyond that, suggesting that either the settlement has come to an end or it has shifted elsewhere. Now, these are really nice, and they obviously very visually impactful, certainly beautiful artifacts, but sometimes smaller things can tell very big stories, such as this. Looks very, very unassuming, but once sent to the specialist, they were able to identify it as the spout of a Roman tetina, or in, as we would understand it, a baby milk bottle. So used for feeding babies. And fortunately for us, this is something that is undergoing a lot of research at the moment, with researchers at several universities looking into lipid analysis within the spout. So a particularly special scientific method where you can look at residues of fats stored within the ceramic that would give us an indication of what they were feeding the babies. And in some occasions, obviously, it's the what we would expect, a combination of human and cow milk, but also there's been an awful lot of wine being used. And I'm sure any parents listening might understand why they might be doing that. But yes, so fantastic find. But interestingly, what they were also able to point out to us is that this is a type of vessel that's almost exclusively found on military sites. So either we happen to be an odd one out and we have one that has been found within a civilian context, or have we got some form of direct activity associated with the Legion at Basingstoke? We've also then got conservation, and that gives me the opportunity to highlight one of our really special finds from Basingstoke, and this was our Triskel mount. So this is a late Iron Age product produced by the British, possibly in Prestatyn. However, it's being produced in the late 1st century, so this is very much after the Roman conquest, but they appear to be continuing to produce them, presumably with acceptance by the Romans, and actively trading them with the Romans. Now, artifacts like this are particularly rare, especially these Triskel mounts. They're often found in fragments, whereas this one is complete. So it was particularly exciting for Flintshire Museum services. But the issue, as you can see in areas of this, very soon after it was taken out of the ground, it started to degrade very quickly and started to laminate. So one of the important things, therefore, we have to do after the excavation is get them conserved. And fortunately, we were able to engage Durham University to assist us with that, and this was the outcome. A fantastically preserved Triskel mount, which now hopefully will be with us for many more years to come and will be looked after by Flintshire Museums. And then just to sort of towards the end of this, one of the other things we do on sites is collect environmental samples of our deposits. So if you've worked with us on excavations, you'll notice very oddly, we take lots of white buckets and we fill them with soil from particular samples or particular deposits. And there's a good reason for this, because it can produce fantastic results. These are processed through a process called flotation, where they are put through a special tank and with basically full of water, it's agitated and it separates out all the little bits that float to the surface. They're caught in a filter, and then everything at the bottom is then sieved and processed through in a painstaking manner. And the aim of that is to recover as much both floral and faunal remains as we can. So by that, of course, I mean fragments of wood, charcoal, seeds, but also animal bone, shell. And the results of basing work, from this, we've got a dominance of oak and which appears to be being used as a primary fuel, which is often the case in Britain, as certainly in antiquity, oak was by far the dominant tree in this country. But then we also have fruitwoods, which are often found as being a preferred kindling. But also then we have hazel. So that actually in itself gives us an idea of the sort of trees that are growing nearby. But also interestingly, we recovered these shells you can see on the side here. And they belong to a particular type of snail that is only found in forested and mossy climates, suggesting that we are looking at an area that is predominantly wooded at the time. So these are being found in a combination of the Romano-British and what could be medieval deposits as well. Now, what we've also got highlighted here is at the base of our medieval cut ditch, we recovered a lot of charred remains associated with what we would term clearance. So charred remains of bramble, elder, and other weeds that are the sort of pioneering plants that tend to grow after a site has been soon cleared and abandoned. So to us, that is a good indication of a site having been cleared after a period of abandonment. So often a preferred way of clearing areas in a quick way is to burn it. And that could explain why we've got these types of charred remains finding their way into our defensive ditch. But then we've also got the faunal remains, the larger stuff, the animal bone. So, and that in itself, by analysing it, can tell us a story about the site. So obviously the immediate go-to is what people will be eating, but it's also their relationship with the animals, and which in antiquity in the past compared to how we see animals now was much more holistic. And what we've identified at Basingwork is, in part, we've got a dominance of domestic livestock on site. So the sort of stuff we would expect sheep, cattle, pig, horse, and a complete absence of the more hunted animals, so deer and boar as well, which we would often find in assemblage. But also what was identified is a lot of these animals, there's a very poor representation of juveniles, and a lot of them are living to a fairly old age. And you can see here, we've got the second phalange of a pig on the left and right, whereas one side is the pig, the poor thing has been suffering very heavily with arthritis. You can see the very extensive bone growth around the joint, suggesting in part that that pig had grown to a reasonable age. That, although that's not particularly unusual for the period because of the more sort of holistic approach they had towards livestock and farming in general. But it potentially also suggests a dominance of secondary products rather than meat. So they are after fertilizer, milk, wool, that sort of thing, as opposed to meat as a direct product. Of course, the issue with studying animal remains and studying a lot of things like this is that there are biases in this assemblage and the potential for bias, especially in such, we're saying that there is a lack of juveniles, but there's the potential that any butchery associated with what people are eating is being done elsewhere or taken elsewhere. So therefore, we're not seeing that in what we are excavating. And that potentially one day we are going to come across a midden, and that will completely change our understanding of diet on the site. So that pretty much wraps up what I was saying. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of what we're trying to achieve at the moment. Certainly Basingwork and Croxton's, they are very much ongoing projects. So we hope to have lots more updates and information coming out about them over the next few months, or certainly within next year. So I will pass back over now, and hopefully we can now run into questions.
Ja, diolch yn fawr, Chris.